Good morning. I'm just delighted to welcome everybody here today. We are very honored to have Dr. Lonnie Bunch, who will discuss the history and challenges of building a national museum from scratch, which is set to open in 2016. I also want to thank Senator Reed for joining us this morning, too. Why are we doing this here right now? First of all, we love having Dr. Bunch anytime he wants to come to Brown. You're always welcome. I know you've been here before and talked to students, which is great. But this is also something important for us because it roughly coincides with the opening of Brown Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, which has now been ongoing for about a year, maybe a little bit more. And I wanted to draw some parallels between the opening and establishment of this museum, which is a grand national project, and something that's been very important to Brown, which is establishing the Center for Slavery and Justice here, which Dr. Tony Bogues is directing. This is a center that stemmed from a report, and this was the University Slavery and Justice Report. Before I even came to Brown, I was given a set of documents to read about the university, and the first one was this report. And I remember reading it, and I remember just being incredibly impressed with the thought and care and sensitivity and honesty that went into that report. And what it did was it really opened the eyes of this community to a serious omission and our understanding of our past. And it called for moral leadership on the part of Brown University to do a number of things, and one of which was to establish a center for the study of slavery and justice. The report really said to us, well, we can do better than we have done before. It said to us, we have to recognize the contributions that enslaved African people made to the founding and creation of this university. And it called upon us to examine in a serious way the legacies of slavery and servitude and do everything we can do now, not only to understand the past, but to use our understanding of the past to inform what we do now in the present. Walking through the exhibit coming in today and seeing the transition from the Emancipation Proclamation to 100 years later, the Civil Rights Movement. And I would add, although it's not represented in that exhibit, 50 years later to today, where we're still dealing with very, very serious struggles and a need for much greater justice in our communities of color. So all of these are very important things for discussion. So I wanted to go into some detail on that because I see this national monument as playing a very similar role on a much grander scale. And it's very exciting. The Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, another reason why I think the connections are so apt is it partners with the National African American Museum at the Smithsonian, as well as with several museums across the world, on a global curatorial project on slavery called Knowledge of the Enslaved, a Global Curatorial Project. And this project will include a series of international workshops with scholars and curators, and it'll map new ways of exhibiting slavery and present new research and knowledge about the historical influences of slavery on the contemporary world. So this collaborative project will culminate in a traveling exhibition beginning in 2018. So it's something I'm very much looking forward to seeing playing out over time. So now I would like to turn the floor over to the inaugural director of the Center of Slavery and Justice, Dr. Tony Bogues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Paxson. President Paxson, Senator Jack Reed, Dr. Lonnie Bunch, founding director of the National African American Museum of History and Culture at the Smithsonian, Dean of the Faculty, Professor Kevin McLaughlin, ladies and gentlemen, friends all, the kids from the med school, and their teachers. It is a great honor and privilege that the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice has to really have on Brown's campus Dr. Lonnie Bunch and Senator Jack Reed here with us today. A program that is very simple. I will make some very brief introductory remarks, followed by Senator Reed, who will introduce Dr. Bunch. Dr. Bunch will give a presentation, and then there will be a Q&A in which I will moderate. I would want to say from the beginning that in terms of moderating, that we would like our questions and comments to be focused on the museum. These are very tumultuous times, and typically in these times, people who get asked all sorts of other questions, and rightly so. But we would like the questions to focus, if you wish, on the museum. 2 years ago, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice was formed. We are closing now our third year, and have become known as some kind of entity on Brown's campus, as well as within the Providence community. The center is a research center with a public education mission. That is, it takes seriously not only research, but what is called public history and what sometimes is called the public humanities, but what we call in the center a public curriculum. The center is divided around, or works around, 5 research clusters: slavery, history, and modernity, beginning to develop a network of scholars on slavery as well as artists, a research project on human trafficking, contemporary human trafficking, a project on the legacies of racial slavery. It's called School to the Pipeline, and School to Prison Pipeline, and then a project called Global Curatorial Project on enslaved knowledges. For the center, public education or public curriculum is really critical. And it is one of the reasons why we have formed this alliance and work in relationships with national museums. And it is also why we are involved with the National Reconciliation Center and the move and the impulse and desire of the Episcopalian Church to turn the St. John's Cathedral on North Main Street into a center for national reconciliation, but also for a center for slavery, a slavery museum. And 3 of the members of the Episcopalian Diocese are sitting down here at the moment. For the center, therefore, what is critical? What is critical is for us to build an institutional space on Brown's campus and in Providence in which certain challenges can be confronted. Challenges which are sometimes seen outside of the mainstream, but really which should be part of the mainstream conversation that we need to have. Challenges, therefore, not about easy or soft things. Challenges about some real difficult things, but difficult things that we need to actually try to address and have a conversation about. Things like slavery and its legacies in the United States, how it has shape our contemporary world, the relationship of anti-black racism and structures to the questions of slavery and the ways in which it has shaped our country and indeed the world. In that regard, therefore, we are really delighted and honored to have Lonnie here. I just spent a day and a half at the museum on the weekend talking to the curatorial staff about the project that we are all doing together, the Global Curatorial Project, but also about the museum, and was taken around. And one of the things that struck me was that every single curator I spoke to was inspired by the work of Dr. Bunch. At lunch, whether we were having lunch, very nice lunch in the cafe downstairs, or we were having just general conversations and walking from building to building, from the West Wing, and I thought, television. I'm in DC, the West Wing, walking from the West Wing over to the East Wing for another meeting. And so therefore, what I think is important is to understand Dr. Bunch's real achievement, and an achievement of building something that was, I think, thought impossible 50, 60 years ago, but something which is in fact is now becoming a reality. But also in doing this project, that the museum and its curators, led by Dr. Bunch, has pushed boundaries as to how stories should be told. And that's one of the fascinating things I found talking to the curators, just the ways in which we were really talking, very quickly, sometimes at warp speed, about what it is to do public history, around questions of slavery, around questions of freedom, around questions of music, African American music, and so on, around visual art, the gallery and visual art. And it was like a staccato, conversation between myself and the curators. So it was just remarkable, but all of them inspired by the work by your leadership, Dr. Bunch. So we're really very happy that you are here, and that in fact what the work that you do and you're leading pushes boundaries. I want to thank Senator Jack Reed, whose office got in touch with us about doing this. And I want to say thank you as well, sir, for the tremendous support that you have been giving to the museum, and that I think you give to things that are very important for American life. So thank you very much, Senator Reed. And now I want to turn the proceedings over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for that very gracious introduction and for your great work here. President Paxson, thank you for your leadership at Brown University, and a special thank you to Lonnie Bunch for joining us. Doctor, you've done a superb job. You have been the driving force behind this museum since before it became a physical reality, and it was a proposal, so thank you very much. The National Museum of African American History and Culture is and will be a vital institution for all Americans because it tells America's story. It tells a very important part of America's story. Every generation of Americans have grappled with the issues of race and justice and equality and opportunity as we strive for a more perfect union, striving and not succeeding, but continuing to strive. The National Museum of African American History and Culture will be opening as we mark key milestones in our quest to live up to our founding principles. The 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, the anniversary of the end of slavery, but as we all recognize, the beginning of the quest for real justice, which goes on today. We took a long time to take steps to ensure or better ensure justice. It was not until the 1960s, when I was a youngster, that we had significant civil rights legislation, voting rights, led by the moral leadership of Dr. King and the political ingenuity of Lyndon Johnson. We were able to do that. But we have more to do. It was 50 years ago also, too, that we understood that justice was not just de jure, and I've exhausted all my Latin for all that. But justice meant good schools. It meant good preschools. It meant Head Start. It meant Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It meant the Higher Education Act. It meant giving everyone a fair chance and a fair opportunity. And again, we have much, much work to do. We still see disparities by race, by income, by gender, in access to these opportunities. We've seen it in the operation of our law enforcement agencies, tragically, over the last several months. We've seen it in the quality of living and housing. It was shocking to read about the incidents in Baltimore and to recognize that one of the elements was contributing to that community's problems was exposure to lead in homes for young children, something that we've been fighting for years to rid an unnecessary and completely curable illness. But we have to put the resources there. We have to have good health care, and good libraries, and good museums, and access for everyone everywhere. We strive to be a nation united, but we're discovering sometimes we live separate lives. And that's what the genius of this institution at Brown, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and the National Museum. It's to connect these separate lives into the fabric of one America. That's our challenge. And we can't do it without Dr. Bunch's leadership and Dr. Bogues' leadership and the university here at Brown. Sometimes it takes tragedy to remind us and to shock us to recognition and to effort. And we hope that we are prepared to go forward now much more realistically and much more emphatically on that long, long march to justice. What we're going to create here and what Dr. Bunch will lead is a forum for all Americans to come together to join these separate lives again into a fabric of one America. No one is better prepared to do that. I know that because I served for years as a regent on the Smithsonian, and all these nagging requests for aid and assistance, and we're not doing enough to get this thing done. And then I also had, because I'm multiply fortunate, the chairmanship of the Interior Subcommittee that appropriated the money. Not enough money. What, you're not giving us enough money. So thank you, Doctor, because through your efforts, the building will soon open. And you bring to this endeavor such knowledge, such skills, such sensibility from all of your work as a scholar, as someone in the museum world, and someone with deep ties to the Smithsonian. And you are committed, as no one else is in this country, to sharing these stories so that we're a better country, that we are one nation, united, just, and helping each other to move forward. And with that, please let me welcome, and let all welcome, Lonnie Bunch.
Well, thank you all for those kind words. I'm just some guy from Jersey trying to make it in the big city. I want to tell you, though, how much it means to me to be here and to be with you. Senator Reed has been crucial to the success of this museum. I want to be really candid. We would not be where we are, which is just around the corner from opening, without your support. It meant a lot to us, both as I would stand in front of the regents and say, trust me, he would trust me. And so I really want you to know how much I appreciate your leadership. And this morning I called my 88-year-old mother to check on her and told her I was on my way up here to speak at Brown, and she said, you finally got in. So thank you. Made my mother happy. I want to take a minute and talk about the challenge of building a national museum. And I guess the best way is to frame it through a story that has shaped my career. Early in my career at the Smithsonian, I was doing an exhibition on history of the 19th century, and I wanted to look at the story of slavery. But I decided that I wanted to look at it through the lens of a single plantation rather than the broad look at the institution. So I traveled all around the country visiting plantations. I was in Louisiana looking at rice plantations, looking at sugar plantations. I was in Alabama wrestling with cotton plantations. There were some amazing tobacco plantations in North Carolina. And then above Georgetown, South Carolina, I found a rice plantation. It's called the Old Friendfield Rice Plantation. And what was amazing about it was that when you pull in, there were still 8 or 9 cabins from the enslaved that were still standing. And next to the cabin was a man, Mr. Johnson. He was in his 90s. And he had lived in this cabin with his enslaved grandmother. So for a historian, this is the Holy Grail, to be able to talk to somebody who actually lived with someone who was enslaved. And Mr. Johnson was amazing. He took me to the front of the cabin, and he talked about how the enslaved took a broom and did a hard sweep, swept the ground so that there'd be no vermin, no grass. He took me to one side, and he talked for 20 minutes about the role of children and the chimney, looking at the chimney, making sure it didn't catch fire, making sure it didn't fall down. And then he took me to the third side in the back, and he said, here is where his grandmother grew the crops to supplement what the master gave them. And then we went to the fourth side, or rather, I went to the fourth side. Mr. Johnson didn't come, and I said, Mr. Johnson, what happened over here? He said, son, I'm not going over there. So I'm a young scholar thinking I'm going to find something really amazing. And I said, Mr. Johnson, please come over here. He said, son, I'm not going to go over there because there's nothing but rattlesnakes over there. Now, after I stopped running, I said to Mr. Johnson, why didn't you tell me? And he said, son, everybody used to remember. Now they forget. But if you're a historian, your job is to help people remember not just what they want, but what they need. And in some ways, the struggle to create a museum to help Americans remember not just what they want, but what they need about the African American experience has been going on for 100 years. The idea for this museum began in 1913. That was the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And you may remember there were all these wonderful pictures of old Yankees and old rebels shaking hands, but never anybody African American. And yet 200,000 African Americans participated in the Civil War. So there was this great desire to craft something on the mall that would remember that participation. They actually began to get legislation discussed, but then World War I happened, kind of took everybody's attention away. Then the idea lies fallow until the late 1920s when Calvin Coolidge, yes, this is one of the few times you will say that name, when Calvin Coolidge actually took up the mantle and had legislation passed to get a museum on the mall. Unfortunately, the Depression hits, no museum. No ideas for museums until the 1960s, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King. But again, couldn't get the political support to do this, didn't have the will. This museum really doesn't come to fruition until 2003, when after many years of introducing this bill, a bipartisan effort with John Lewis, the wonderful leader of the civil rights movement, Sam Brownback, and many others came together and supported this museum. And in 2005, I came back to try to run this museum. And I have to tell you, 10 years ago, we started with a staff of 2. We had no idea where the museum would be, where that building would be. Obviously, we had no architect to help us envision this museum. And unlike almost any other museum, we didn't have any collections at all, nothing. Nor did we have any real benefactors who said, here's $10 million for your museum. What we really had was the faith of Congress and the hopes and expectations of generations who believed that this museum would have to happen. And so I always said when we began that endeavor that at 8 o'clock in the morning, I had the best job in the world. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, this was the dumbest thing I've ever done in my entire life. Think about it. On the one hand, you walk into a room and they say, build a museum. Trying to figure out what are all those challenges that would shape building a museum. I think the first was simple, was trying to create a vision of what should an African American museum be, what should an African American museum as part of the Smithsonian be, and what should a museum be in the 21st century? What was its public role, its scholarly role? And in some ways, crafting a vision was shaped by somebody who really meant a lot to me when I was in Chicago. I got to know, thanks to my dear friend Studs Terkel, I got to know maybe Till Mobley, the mother of Emmett Till, the boy who was brutally murdered in 1955. And she used to talk to me all the time about the fact that she had carried the memory of Emmett Till, and she felt institutions needed to carry that memory, carry that history. So in some ways, crafting a national museum, part of the vision was easy. To create a place that allows us to remember the Emmett Tills, to remember George Washington Carver, to remember Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King and Sojourner Truth, the names we know, maybe in new ways. But maybe even more importantly, this museum, had to help people remember all those that get left out of the narrative, get left out of history. Remember the enslaved woman who got up every day and fed her kids before she went into the field, and how she refused to let the field strip her of her humanity, of her hope. It had to remember the family that left Mississippi for the south side of Chicago in 1913, looking for a better day. It had to remember people like my grandmother, who scrubbed other people's floors, who took in other people's laundry so our children and grandchildren wouldn't have to. It had to be a museum that, as John Hope Franklin used to whisper in my ear all the time, it had to tell the unvarnished truth. It had to be a place where you would cry as you ponder the pain of slavery and segregation. It had to help Americans confront its tortured racial past, but it also had to be a place where you find the joy that is in this community. You had to be able to tap your toes to Duke Ellington or Aretha Franklin or somebody from the hip-hop world. I have no idea who it is, but somebody. You had to really find, almost as the way Senator Reed said, you had to find the fact that this museum could bring us together and not divide us. And so in some ways, the second part of this vision was really important, and that was to create a museum that used African American culture as a lens to understand what it means to be an American. To say that in many ways, this is not an attempt to create something for black people, but rather the story of the African American is in some ways the quintessential American story. When you think of core American values of resiliency, of optimism, of spirituality, where better to look than within this community? When you think about the notions of the expansion of liberty and the redefinitions of citizenship in this country, where better to look? In some ways, it strikes me so much with the work that you're doing, the notion of being able to say, how does this community really bring America into modernity? How does it make us a different place? And so in some ways, recognizing that this museum had to be built for all, regardless of race, regardless of whether your family's been here 200 years or got here 20 minutes ago, this is your story. And that notion of saying this is the story of us all is really crucial to this museum. But then we also realized that for this to work, it had to be a place that really spoke of collaboration. One of the great strengths of the Smithsonian is that it's an amazing educational opportunity. People will come to the Smithsonian and wrestle with stories, histories, issues that they won't wrestle with in Boston, Chicago, or LA. But they'll do it at the Smithsonian. So what we wanted to do was recognize that we could be a beacon that could draw people actually and virtually to the Smithsonian. But then we can push them back to local museums. So therefore, if you're looking at the story of the migration of African Americans from the South to the North, we also say, see how they explore that at the DuSable Museum, or what does the Louisiana State Museum do? In essence, the goal is to recognize that our work should make all those who wrestle with history, who wrestle with race, better. But also, it struck me that if we were going to do this museum, it also had to help Americans do something they don't do very well, which is wrestle with international global considerations. We don't do global well in America. And so the goal was to say, how do we craft a museum that allows us to understand how global considerations have shaped the African American, the American experience since its inception? And how does the African American experience then shape the rest of the world? And it really came home to me, this idea, when I was in Lapland, I was in Stockholm, and I always wanted to go to Lapland, so I went to Lapland. Has to do with fourth grade geography. I won't go into detail. But I'm sitting under a reindeer tent with a village elder, and the translator says the elder has two questions. First question is, are you an American? Got it, yes. The second question, do you know Al Green? I say, Al Green, the musician? And they said, yes, this is it. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, if this culture could shape Lapland in the middle of, it's a pretty powerful culture. And when I got back, I called Al Green. Of course, he said, of course they know about me. But so it really struck me that the challenge was initially to craft an institution that would really find a way to find bridges, but also a way to sort of illuminate all the dark corners of the American experience. But I was struck then by the challenge of, how do you do that conceptually? How do you do that? Think about it. When you try to figure out what a national museum could be, you have to ask yourself all these interesting questions. what does national mean in a transnational age? What's the role of Africa in an African American museum? Can you really create a museum that goes beyond giving simple answers to complex questions? Can you create a museum whose goal might be to help Americans embrace ambiguity, embrace complexity? Can you craft an institution that can really find reconciliation and healing around issues that have divided us for generations? In some ways, the question really is, how do you take this story? How do you take these moments, some difficult, some ripe with resiliency? How do you humanize this? How do you make this a story that we can all engage? And you think about, the question is, on the one hand, they said, do what you want. But imagine walking into a room and saying, okay, out of all the stories you could tell, what are the stories you tell in this museum? How do you decide? Do you tell the story of civil rights? Do you tell the story of slavery? Do you tell the story of fine arts? Do you tell the story of music? Do you tell the story of sports? Suddenly you begin to have a list and you realize you need 4 museums to tell this story. So the challenge really was to craft a museum that would be comprehensive but not encyclopedic, that would give people an opportunity to wrestle with the best scholarship, to wrestle with the kind of best of what the Smithsonian does in its presentations, but that in some ways forces the public to realize that while you can come here, this is the point of departure. There are other places you have to go to get the complete story. In some ways, for me, the question really was, how do you craft a museum that is both worthy of the Smithsonian, but also worthy of the rich history and culture of the African American community? And the challenge of doing that was really something very interesting, and I could talk more about how we did it. But it seems to me that one of the things that also was a really huge challenge that undergird this was basically the perceptions of people of what they thought this museum would be. I remember not too long ago after beginning, I received a letter that began, "Dear left-wing historian." So I knew it wasn't a fan letter, I knew that much. But it was a really serious letter because the person wrote, "What happened to the Smithsonian I loved? It used to be a place that celebrated America, that told these stories of American achievement and accomplishment. And you're now building a museum that will raise stories that are better left unsaid." And then he wrote a line that I thought was very powerful. He said, "After all, don't you know America's greatest strength is its ability to forget?" Well, I'm out of work if we do that. But what hit me was that those were important considerations. How do you sort of let people realize that that kind of complexity, those kinds of issues will be wrestled with in this museum? But I must admit, the rest of the letter went on to say that this museum shouldn't be built, that historians like you shouldn't be hired, that it's a horrible thing for the Smithsonian to do. But I must admit, it threw me off because he signed it, "Best wishes for your continued success." But the notion of saying, how do you negotiate the different notions of what this museum could be? I get letters from African Americans who say to me, this has to be a Holocaust museum. It has to be about what they did to us. I get other people who pull me aside and say, you know, you have an opportunity to inspire new generations of students. So don't do difficult things. Talk about famous images and positive people. Or I remember the day after we had the groundbreaking, I was at work very early and I was walking with my head down. It was about 6:45 in the morning, and there is an elderly African American woman approaching me. So I'm moving out of her way, but she keeps moving in front of me. Finally, she stops me and says, "I'm very proud of you." She hugs me, and then when she hugs me and she whispers, she says, "But please don't tell the story of slavery." So in some ways, what I realized is that the challenge for this museum was to find the ways to negotiate those different views. And what makes it very hard in some ways is that unlike, let's say, the Holocaust Museum, in many ways, the people who were the perpetrators, the bad guys sometimes, were other Americans. And that's really challenging for us as a country, to begin to wrestle with our own culpability. I'm not interested in pointing fingers and saying guilt. What I'm interested in is telling a true history that allows us to grapple with who we once were, who we are today, and maybe who we can be. And so I think wrestling with the kind of sense of the audience anticipation was a really big challenge. I'll tell you the challenge that surprised me, though, was building a staff. Abraham Lincoln used to always say, "Save me from office seekers." I did not realize how many people would want to come to work for the museum, and that's been great. But the challenge is to build a national museum with the kind of visibility and glare of the Smithsonian takes people who are comfortable with ambiguity, who are comfortable with that view. And what I've been struck by has been that people who sometimes want to come work with us want to work in a way that is in a box. I would say to someone, give me the best way we can use technology in a new museum. And they may come back and say, here's a curricular package on the Civil War. So my goal was to kind of force people to think more broadly, to recognize you only have one shot to build a national museum, to do it right. But also, part of what hit me were all the people who kept calling me for jobs. One day I got a call from a woman who said that she wanted me to hire her daughter. And her daughter did something we didn't need. And I said, we don't really have that position right now. And the woman said, well, but Lonnie, don't you know who I am? I didn't know. Turned out, as she put it, that we were in third grade together. And she wanted to know that we had these connections. And I'm sitting there going, third grade, Joanne. Oh, I didn't like her in third grade. I remember that. That's mean. Her daughter's not with us, but she may be. But I think the challenge was really to figure out, how do you find people who really understand that this is an American story, that this is something that a diverse lot of Americans should wrestle with? And one of the things I'm proudest of is I probably have the most diverse staff of any museum in America, because I thought it was really important to sort of embed in all the sense of how this is, in many ways, the quintessential American story. But I would argue that the challenge that worried me the most was not raising money, because we had great support from Senator Reed and others. What worried me was, could we build the collections? After all, if the Smithsonian built a museum that was just ripe with technology, it would fail. Because people come to see the Greensboro lunch counter that I collected years ago, or the Wright Flyer, the Ruby Slippers, the Hope Diamond. So my worry was, could we find that kind of artifacts that would tell the story? And part of the notion was that we had to believe, because we didn't have money to buy things, and many things were in other people's hands, we had to believe that maybe all of the 20th century, most of the 19th century, and maybe a little bit of the 18th century was still in basements, trunks, and attics. So we created this notion, like, I'll steal from anybody. So we took Antique Roadshow, we called it Saving African American Treasures, and went around the country. And basically went into places, worked with local museums to ask people to bring out material. Not so much that we would take it, but that we'd help them preserve grandma's old shawl, or that wonderful oval photograph, or that early tintype that you had. And what that did is it, first of all, created a conversation of what people had. And then they would come to us and they'd say, you know what, we've got this, do you want it? And often what we would do is encourage people to give material to local museums. So therefore, when the Smithsonian came, we didn't come in and just take. You benefited. But if it was, in the scholarly parlance, really cool, it came back to D.C. Okay? But I was struck by the things that we found. As a result of being in Philadelphia, a collector called me and said he had material from Harriet Tubman. Now, I got to be honest, I'm a 19th century historian. There's like 2 artifacts from Harriet Tubman in her house in Mount Auburn, New York. There's just nothing to be found. Well, this guy said, look, come up to Philadelphia and I will show you these treasures. So I almost didn't go, but I thought, well, at least I can get a Philadelphia cheesesteak out of the deal, right? So I go to Philadelphia, and this guy takes me into a room, and he pulls out a box. And he opens this box, and the first thing he does is he pulls out photographs of Harriet Tubman's funeral that no one had ever seen. So he's got my attention, and he keeps pulling out things. And then he pulls out a shawl. And there's a famous picture of Harriet Tubman 3 days before she died, wrapped in the shawl. And there it was in front of me. And then he pulled out her hymnal that had all those spirituals that she would sing. Steal Away to Jesus, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And even though Harriet Tubman could not read, she carried this hymnal for 50 years. By the time that hymnal came out, I'm crying. And he said to me, this should be in the Smithsonian, and gave it to the museum. Or I'm taken by the woman who came up to me after a talk like this, and she said that she had quit Brandeis University in 1963 to go south to help in the civil rights movement, and that she was in Birmingham, and she opened a bag, and in the bag were glass shards from the 16th Street Baptist Church after it had been bombed. She had shards from the stained glass window. Imagine being able to tell those stories with these kinds of artifacts. Or I was moved by the fact that Chuck Berry called and said, would you like my guitar that I wrote Maybelline on? And if you want the guitar, you also have to take my candy apple red Cadillac. So I thought, okay, I know what the guitar, I don't know about the Cadillac, but what was so interesting was that we cut this deal, everything was done, and I sent a young man on my staff, a junior scholar, to go out and sign the paperwork and bring the stuff back. Well, Chuck Berry said, well, I'm not sure that I really want to do this now, but I want to know if I can trust the museum. And so my young curator said, well, what does that mean? He says, well, come have lunch with me. Okay. Well, the curator sat down with Chuck Berry, and Chuck Berry brought out 25 ice cream sandwiches. So lunch was ice cream sandwiches. After they ate 12 ice cream sandwiches each, Chuck Berry said, I now trust you, you can have the artifacts. The way we get collections is pretty amazing. But I think the best way to describe these collections is the way they happen in a way I wouldn't expect. We have something that, in my mind, rivals Harriet Tubman, and that is we have Nat Turner's Bible. When Nat Turner led the slave insurrection in 1831, he was a slave preacher. He could read. He had a Bible. And I had gone down to Southampton County where the insurrection occurred, and I had talked on National Public Radio about, boy, wouldn't it be great to find something on Nat Turner, but I know we're not going to. Well, it turned out when Nat Turner was captured, he had a sword and he had a Bible. And the Bible was given to the family, the Francis family, who had lost many people in the insurrection. And the family had kept it for generations. And finally someone said, we need to get this out of our house. And they called me and gave us the Bible. And to be honest, I wasn't, is it really the Bible? So we did a lot of research. It turned out the Bible came from the American Missionary Society in 1818. And then we found a photo of the Bible from 1870. We were able to digitize it, and we matched all the water spots. So it really helped us believe that we could find that. And I could go on and on and on. The reality is that from zero, we have gone to now 40,000 artifacts, whether they are slave cabins, airplanes that the Tuskegee Airmen flew, gold medals that Carl Lewis won in the Olympics. We're able to tell this amazing story because of the way people trust the Smithsonian. But in some ways, I think the last two challenges, one is the challenge of fundraising. Now, I have to be honest that legislatively, in terms of the building, Congress would give 50%, and then we'd have to raise 50%. And so at this stage, we have raised $482 million in order to build this museum. And that's because the fact that Congress gave us money to begin to prime the pump, but also we were able to put together an amazing board. That this is the only board that Oprah Winfrey's on, Laura Bush is on this board, the head of Time Warner, the head of American Express, the head of IBM. And what really amazed me is that these folks stayed with this process for 10 years. Think about it. You all serve on boards. You don't serve for 10 years. But the reality was this was that important. And because of them, we've been able to raise so much money. And what I love, though, is, yes, we've gotten unbelievably large amounts of money from Oprah Winfrey and Bill Gates. But what moves me most are the fact that there are 80,000 people who signed up as members for $25, and they get their little card. And every time I go somewhere, somebody pulls out a card and says, I'm a member. It's the fact that the average person also cares about this is what is so meaningful. But I guess in a way, the last challenge I will focus on is really the challenge of building a building the National Museum. When we started, we had no idea exactly where the building would be. Ultimately, we have the best spot in America next to the Washington Monument within the shadow of the White House. And this allows us to craft an amazing building. And what was so powerful to me is I underestimated how important, how much interest there would be in this building. When it was announced that I was coming back from Chicago to take this job, I was out of the country. By the time I got back to my house in Chicago, there were 15 packets from architects already saying, I could build your building. And one of the things that has happened over the period of this has been, until we figured out who the architect would be, hundreds of architects, because you want to build on the National Mall. Well, a lot of times we get unsolicited things. One time I received a packet of 150 drawings of what the architect said, I will give you what this building should look like. Well, those 150 drawings were the building in the shape of a Black Power fist. Now, there are many things I could get through Congress, the regents. I don't think so, okay? And the reality is, though, the question around what should the building be? In some ways, I got that question more than anything else. Should the building look African American? I don't know what that meant. Should the building look African? Should the building look like the 19th century? Should it be a more modern structure? In some ways, the question really was, how do you craft something that is part of the National Mall, but that elevates the National Mall, that is architecturally innovative, and that also speaks to this community? And one of the things we did is we ran an international competition from around the world, 70 different architectural teams. And ultimately, we chose a team that consisted of Americans and a young designer named David Adjaye from the UK. And they put together a building that is now 71.8% complete. Not that I'm paying attention. And I want to show you a fly-through of the building to give you a sense of just a little bit of the shape of the building, what it would look like.
I think it turned itself off. Yeah.
Oh,
It's going to take
Okay.
seconds to warm up. Let me go get that one.
all right. Well, while it's warming up, what I want you to look at is that one of the things that we wanted to do is every time you're in a building on the mall in Washington, you're in the building. I thought that you're on the mall, you should take advantage of the vistas and the viewpoints and give people a sense. So imagine in this building, you'll be able to see an exhibit on the March on Washington, then look out and see the Lincoln Memorial. Or see down the road where slave pens were along Pennsylvania Avenue. So the goal of the building is to recognize that the mall itself is sacred space, and that we want people to see that as well as we're in the building. So clearly, it's going to be part of iconic Washington. One last thing about the building. The building is a bronze corona. And what I wanted was, the architect said, well, we've got to puncture holes in that because it can't be solid bronze. What I realized is that we needed to make a statement. And so the building itself got a filigree on it that was taken from the work of enslaved craft people from Charleston and New Orleans. So it reflects all that ironwork. So in a way, what it is, it's a way to say so much of America's history is hidden in plain sight, that we really want people to see that. But let me conclude by saying that this has been a long journey, and the fact that there are now over 175 people working to build this museum tells me that within the next 18 months, we will open to the public. President Obama has agreed to cut the ribbon, so we will make sure that happens while he's still in office. Ex-presidents don't get to cut the ribbon, so we want to make sure you got to be in office. But I think the reality is, the best way to think about it is that this has to be a museum that on the one hand is a part of the Smithsonian, but it has to be a museum that helps us use the past to find weapons to live our lives, to give people ways to understand Ferguson and Baltimore, to give people a way to understand the long tortured history, but also the history of a work in progress. I guess the best way to describe it is, for me, this is an opportunity for the Smithsonian to give back. There's a wonderful quotation during the late 30s, during the WPA, when historians were interviewing the enslaved. They interviewed a man named Cornelius Holmes. He was from the rice plantation that I actually spent time at. And he said that he was asked, well, now, all these years later, does slavery still matter? He said, though the slavery question is settled, its impact is not. It will be with us always, because it is in our politics, it is in our courts, it is on our highways, it is in our minds, it is in our religion, it is in all that we do, all the day, every day. For me, this museum gives America a gift when we help all Americans realize that they are shaped, informed in profound ways by the African American experience, all the day, every day. Thank you.
Floor is open to questions. We have a couple of minutes. Yes, please. Could you say who you are, where you're from, if you don't mind?
My name is Lori Lee. I live here in Providence. I'm a freelance writer. I write for Go Local Prop, the education column. I also have a background in, my specialty was African art and anthropology. And I worked at the National Museum of African Art for a while. I was born in DC, so that's where I'm from. I recently was fortunate enough to go to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, which was also an incredibly moving experience. And I'm just sort of wondering how you envision, whether you think this will be a similar type of experience or how you think it will differ.
One of the things we're looking at is, on the one hand, is to sort of use technology in new ways, that while there'll be amazing exhibitions that will take you from Africa through the election of Obama, that will help you understand that the best way to understand things like the sports and military is as a two-sided coin. That yes, you tell the story of see how well one performed athletically, but it really is, how is athletics used as a means for social justice, as a means to sort of demand change. But what we want to do is recognize that thanks to the technology, we have opportunities to let people shape their own experiences as they go through the museum, to leave behind more data and information that can then inform the kind of work we do. We think that in many ways, this will be an experience that will be such that you will find yourself moved, you will find yourself educated, but more importantly, you'll find yourself with the kind of information that will help make you better. That's my goal.
Yes, please.
Hi. Brandon Madison from Concord, Massachusetts.
Hello, Brandon.
You're describing ways for visitors to leave behind their emotions or their thoughts. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about how that?
Sure. The museum is basically divided into 4 parts. There is a huge exhibition that we're just calling the History Galleries that will take you from Africa into the 21st century, right, with a lot of amazing artifacts and technology. Then there is a second floor that is a floor geared just to digital learning. It's a floor that it's for students, but it's also for people to sort of delve in more deeply into the history that we have, but also to leave behind their own stories. So that therefore they could upload photographs as we look at regionalism in America, so they can help us understand their community. As you go from that floor, there's a floor that is looking at community, that as a cornerstone is recognizing that there's not a single African-American community. So therefore, what this exhibit does is give you a sense of what it was like for African-Americans in Charleston in the 1840s. What was it like for African-Americans in the Bronx at the dawn of hip-hop in the 1970s? So that it really gave you this regional sense. And in there is also opportunities for you to help us by telling the story of what was it like to grow up in New Jersey or grow up in the small towns, so people will be able to leave that behind. Then on the 4th floor is a floor that looks at culture, looks at everything from African-American music, fine art, film, theater, TV. And so in a way, what we framed it is that in every one of these galleries, there's opportunities for you to either sit down and leave things behind, or begin to send it when you go back home, to send things to us, so therefore you can continue to inform what the museum does. So the goal is to recognize that we want to give enough guidance so that people actually wrestle with what we've done and think about it when they go home.
Hi, I'm Shari. I write a museum blog, and I have degrees in art history and museum education. And I have a question. It's kind of a big question. And I had the same question when they built the Holocaust Museum. I had the same question when they built the Museum of Native American. We have a Museum of American History. When we build museums to separate, are we segregating? The Museum of American History has a wonderful exhibit on segregation. The Air and Space Museum has a wonderful exhibit on Tuskegee Airmen. Are we, once we build a separate museum, are we taking those cultures out of the Smithsonian and separating them? And what's the rationale behind that, both good and bad?
I don't even have a rationale. Let me explain to you exactly how I feel about that. I was the associate director at the Museum of American History for years. I did the segregation exhibition, okay? My notion is pretty simple, and that is that, first of all, the way we're doing this, and we hope it begins to shape other museums, is to say this is not a separate story, but another way to go into the American story. And one thing I know about a museum like the Museum of American History, museums are artifacts that are hard to change, and that there are so many stories that one didn't anticipate when the museum was built in 1965. And so in some ways, there's just not, even as creative as the curators were. Steve Lubar was one of the best curators I've ever worked with in my life, but even Steve couldn't figure out how to tell all those stories in one building. And so in a way, what I've argued is that the Smithsonian has an opportunity that no other place does. It has an opportunity to say, do not take the Greensboro Lunch Counter from American History. Do not take the Tuskegee story away from the Air and Space Museum, but that rather recognize that what you have is an opportunity to create different portals into what it means to be an American. Some people will come into that portal through the American Art Museum. and see the diversity of America within that. Others will come through the African American Museum and be pushed out to understand what this means to the broader society. So in some ways, I would argue that the best institutions that do this separate in order to integrate. Separate in order to provide the kind of nuance and complexity that you might not be able to get in one building. And I'm just focused on the Smithsonian, saying that within this amazing array of museums, that you have an opportunity to engage people to make sure, regardless of what door you go in, that you get a fuller, complete, complex story of America.
I don't really need a mic, but is it on? Okay. Hi, my name is Gene Montero, and I'm a member of the Board of Trustees at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. A couple of weeks ago, the CEO of that organization and I traveled to Cape Verde, the Cape Verde Islands. And part of our mission was to deliver a traveling exhibit that tells the Cape Verdean story as it pertains to whaling, immigration, et cetera, et cetera. During one of our tours, we went to a place called Ciudad Vella, Old City is what it's translated to. And in that city, as I'm sure you're aware, is a slave post. Will your museum make any reference to that post and also other African connections?
I'm not sure that we're making a connection to that specific post. What we've done is recognize that you can't tell this story without both historically looking at Africa and then looking at the contemporary Africa. So that one of the things we do is we've actually filmed in about 15 of the slave castles along the west coast of Africa, from Angola up to Cape Coast and Ghana, and that you'll be able to actually walk through those as you come into the museum. We've also done a lot of work on looking at sort of the process of the slave trade, so that we will focus on what happened in the interior in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Angola, and how people understand that process. So we'll tell those stories. And I guess the other thing is that I'm not supposed to announce, but what the heck, we're friends. We are about 60 Minutes is doing 3 pieces on the museum. So in 2 weeks, 60 Minutes will announce that we will have done work in Africa looking for slave ships. And that in essence, what I realized is that the story of slavery, there are a lot of places that create artificial slave ship experiences. But I felt it was crucially important to just have a few pieces of a slave ship. So we've actually scoured the world, initially looking in Cuba, but ultimately finding slave ships off the coast of South Africa that we will dive on and bring pieces back. So we're really committed to helping people see things they didn't expect and try to understand the more complex experience of the African and the American experience.
To carry that further, there are quite a few sunken vessels from that era,
right,
that they're diving on off the Cape Verde Island.
Exactly. We have mapped the entire ocean floor, so I can tell you how many exactly are by Cape Verde.
Hi, I'm Glenn Lowry, member of the faculty here at Brown and serve on the academic advisory board for the center. Dr. Bunch, first of all, thank you for this work that you're doing.
Thank you.
This is what I want to ask you. In weaving the experience of the enslaved and their descendants into the American story, are you able to give some voice to questions about the role that the United States plays in the larger global community? I'm talking about militarism, imperialism, and so forth. Is that something that we can get past Congress?
Well, let me answer the last part. I want to be honest. I think that we have never had anybody in Congress say to me, "Don't tell this story." But I also know that the reality is that there are stories that are difficult, and what we've said to everybody is, if you don't want controversy and complexity, don't build this museum, because you can't tell this story without that. So what we have to do is always figure out what are the ways when controversy comes that we survive. right? Part of that is working with the media. Part of that is making sure Congress, which is our biggest donor, understands what we're doing. So I'm very comfortable that we're going to tell stories that not everybody wants to hear. And the story of the military is that two-sided coin. That on the one hand, there is a story of sort of the integration of the military, the role that, from the Revolutionary War through Buffalo Soldiers through Vietnam, and what are the tensions within the military tell us about America, but also what is the sort of almost wonderful ironies by looking at the military. What does it tell us when black men are asked by white men to kill red men, right? What does it tell us when we look at the military as a way to sort of stamp what America is? So I think for us, we want to be able to tell that complexity, recognizing that you can't tell all of that in an exhibition. Right? So what we have to do is craft the most rigorously public program space in order to make sure that we can have those debates, those scholarly debates, those political debates, because I think that in a way, as an educational institution, that's our goal.
Ray? Ray Rickman, Black Heritage Society. George Downing, Ciceretta Jones, Rudolph Fisher, to name you a few. Mm-hmm. Will they get in? This is Rhode Island questions. I thought the senator would want me to ask. And then secondly, take James DeWolf, number one slaver in America, Rhode Island story. Right. Will he get in?
I bet you could imagine that I get that question in every state I'm in. But the reality is that we have made sure that many of the stories that are Rhode Island driven are part of this. Some of the names you mentioned are there. Obviously, the DeWolf story is a real interesting story about sort of commerce and slavery, and that's a story that we're also telling in the museum. Part of what we're also doing here is that we've collected things from the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society. We've collected a variety of things that would allow us, as we go around the country, to help people understand that it didn't happen in a single place, that it had a kind of national ripple. And so we'll make sure that the story of aspects of Rhode Island are in the museum. And then most importantly, it seems to me that what we ought to hope is that by shining the light on that, then local museums do a better job of wrestling with these issues as well.
Thank you. Good to see you again, Dr. Bunch.
How you doing?
Ifa Baeza. I'm a visiting lecturer and artist in residence with Africana Studies. I wonder if you could talk some about your perspective of your vision of the collaboration between independent scholars and centers of scholarship like the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice and independent artists in interacting with the museum, as so many new perspectives on our history and culture are coming from those venues.
Thank you. That's a great question. It's always good to see you. I think that one of the challenges of any institution, and especially the bureaucracy like the Smithsonian, is not to get isolated. Right, to make sure that keeping up with the best scholarship, that's what we're paid to do, but also recognizing that creativity that shapes the work we do comes from many different quarters. So we've looked at creating programs that get artists in residence, that get sort of writers in residence, that really make sure that we're both being able to reflect that in the exhibitions and in the programs, but even more importantly, to reflect that thinking amongst the staff. So that's really important to us to figure out how to do that. Also, part of what I also want to do is figure out what are the things the Smithsonian can do that allows and helps artists do their work. So, for example, we're going to definitely do a lot of work in film. And we're probably going to be able to give an annual fellowship to help young filmmakers finish their work. So we're looking at those kinds of things, that while we can't be everything to all people, what we realized is we're defining what the museum should be in the 21st century, so let's do what we think we can do effectively and obviously find the money for.
Okay, we take a few more questions. 1, 2, 3, and then 4.
Hi, I'm Taylor Michael. I'm a student here at Brown. I study Africana Studies as well as being a part of the Brown Center for Students of Color. And my question is more along the lines of kind of multiculturalism and intersectionality, and how I guess this museum seeks to tell not only the African American story as it relates to the American story, but also as it relates to the Black queer story or the Black woman story or any of those kind of in-between areas and areas that I've not mentioned.
Sure. In some ways, one of the most important parts of the work we've done is to find those boundaries that we could blur, that we could cross. So therefore, LGBT history is crucially important and plays out in a variety of ways in the museum. The fact that we're looking at the role that African descendants play in Spanish-speaking communities, looking at the role that West Indians played when they came to New York in the early 20th century, and the tensions there. So in some ways, the notion of finding those boundaries and blurring them is really important to us, and I think you'll see a lot of that in the museum.
Hi, my name is Elon Cook.
I know you. You used to work for me.
I did. And I actually took the phone call from the guy who wanted to design the museum in the shape of Black.
See? I knew that happened. That was true.
So I'm a recent graduate of the Public Humanities program here at Brown, and also a genealogist. And I was wondering, has there been any movement on finding a way to ensure that there's a center for research into genealogy at the museum? Are there connections being made with the Freedmen's Bureau records, with Ancestry.com, anything like that, so that the museum will maybe be a center for the study of genealogy?
It's good seeing you, kid. We have realized that in all the surveys we did, how central genealogy was. So on the second floor of digital learning, we have a family research center. One of the things we've done is created partnerships. We have worked with Family Search to actually now, when we open, we will actually put online the entire indexed and searchable Freedmen Bureau papers, which obviously, as you know, is one of the great resources for Black and white Southerners in that period of transition. We also, in order to make this work, actually hired a curator of genealogy who's just working on family history and the like, and really trying to determine what can we do that helps. How can we push people to the National Archives and other places? So we just think that family history is a way into the broader history. So while we're not interested in simply being a place to teach you how to use the census records, what we want to do is allow your understanding of your family, its context locally, regionally, and nationally, as also helping us to tell that history. So genealogy is a big deal.
Two other persons.
Hi, I'm Marty Berman with the Jersey boy who wound up in Rhode Island. When I grew up, I think I was given the impression that the Northerners were all for being against slavery and the Southerners were all in favor of slavery. About 30 years ago, I met a graduate student at Brown who proposed a project to look into the support of slavery by the Rhode Island mills. And his professor said, it's not worth looking into. But he did look into it, and I remember his exhibit where he demonstrated that most of the product of the Rhode Island mills was making the slave cloth. And I assume that that story is known to you and will be included.
I think one of the tensions you want to balance is you want to tell the story of slavery through the lens of the enslaved, but on the other hand, you want people to understand how dominant an institution it was, how it's the engine of the economic revolution in America, how it shapes everything from foreign policy to culture to political discourse. So really trying to find that tension to help people see it through specific stories like the factories that made the fabric, to understanding what that meant in the broader sense that so much of the economic prosperity of America is on the back of the enslaved.
Final question? Yep.
My name is Jake Kuling, and I'm a student from the Metropolitan Regional Career and Technical Center here in Providence. As some of you know, while I live in Coventry, So something that's really not a diverse town at all, which is why I think the culture experience. So this school has really furthered me to allow intellectual conversation. So, for example, you had mentioned Baltimore. So that's like a huge issue that's going on right now. It's a big controversy. So even in the classroom when we had talked about it, and there was a lot of uprising from different students and different perspectives. Now, are you going to be able to control that in the museum setting with more people on a larger scale?
I never try to control good debate. What I try to do is set up the fact that people trust the Smithsonian so we can frame those debates. We just did a big conference a week ago Saturday on Ferguson, on Baltimore, and what I was really impressed with was rather than simply have scholars coming in to talk about it, I brought in a lot of the young cultural creators talking about what this impact has on their creativity, on their work. And so we've been able to, because it's the Smithsonian, have the kind of debates that will help people figure out how we can work and live our lives so that we use history to help give us some information, to help us shape that. So from my vantage point, we will have to do it. We will do it carefully. We will do it considered. We will do it in a way that values conflicting points of view. But in some ways, I would argue that's what the Smithsonian ought to be. That the goal of this museum, yes, it'll have the first green museum on the mall. Yes, it will have amazing artifacts that people have never seen. Yes, the exhibitions will be technologically and educationally rich. But the goal of the museum is pretty simple. It's to make America better. Thank you.